Hey, you're back in the garage with TheEZGZ. Today, this topic is going to be single relief versus dual relief engine cases. Whenever you're talking about horsepower, this subject's going to eventually come up as to which is the preferred case to use, or can I do it with my old single port case. As always, Volkswagen people seem to be on a tight budget. It's just our nature. I suppose if money was no object, we'd all be driving fancy Italian cars or something. So money's always a factor, but I want to take a look at this and show you guys the difference between these cases. I inherited this single relief case, and I might eventually do something with it these days if I get ahead on my finances and have the time. Winter's coming. I don't know if I'm going to stay put or not, but let's take a look at these two cases, and they're referred to as a dual relief or a single relief case. There's a lot of other changes that come into play here, and this guy we were talking to just couldn't seem to grasp what we were trying to say. He had a single relief case, and he couldn't see why the dual relief case was really better. So I'm going to try to explain that and cover a few other things while we're at it here. So in the first place, this is the flywheel side of the engine, and this is the back of the engine, we'll call it, the back of the car. It's where the distributor sits down this hole. Your oil pump is underneath the crankshaft on a Volkswagen engine. It is driven by this slot in the cam gear, which sits below the crankshaft. It's driven by the crankshaft by a gear. There's no chains or belts on these type of setups. It's very nice and a good design. Now, when you're talking about relief, you're talking about relieving oil pressure. That's what this is all about. And I'm not going to get in the subject of oil and an oil debate here. The Volkswagen engine was meant to be used with 30 weight oil. It was designed with 30 weight oil in mind in normal weather conditions. If it got extremely cold, they recommended that you go down to a lighter oil, which is a 20 weight oil. And that's what they recommended, straight weight oils with a lot of oil change intervals, and all they had was a screen for a filter. I think they had the idea that it was better to just evacuate all of the oil. They were real proud of their oil bath air cleaner and thought it did a magnificent job of keeping the dirt and grit out from that avenue, but you still had carbon and different things. And you got to remember, back then the oils weren't as good as the oils that we have today. All oils then and now have additives in them to prevent corrosion, to prevent foaming, and generally make the oils last a little bit longer. This isn't going to turn into an oil debate. If somebody wants to know what kind of oil I use whatever oil I feel like at the time. If it doesn't have zinc in it, I add zinc to it. I prefer to add a zinc type oil, and it costs a little bit more. And it depends on the engine and what my finances are at the time. Okay. So let's take a look at this oil relief thing itself. It's located on a single relief case right here. And it's going to have, if you look at it from under your car, there's going to be this big flat screw on it, and it's really hard to get out. There's a crush washer underneath it to seal it so it doesn't drip, but over time they all eventually seem to drip anyhow. Then the next thing that's in here is a spring, and on top of the spring is this piston. So the piston goes in there, this spring goes behind it, and then the cap holds it all in place. as you operate your engine, when you first start it up, the oil is going to be a little bit thicker, and it's going to push this piston down, and it's going to dump some of that oil back into the case. There's a hole that just lets it go right back into the crankcase, and it's going to do that rather than blow the oil cooler. Volkswagens, either kind, are air cooled, and they have external oil coolers. They have seals between the oil cooler and the block, and you don't want to blow those seals out or blow the oil cooler itself. So they came up with this to dump some of that oil pressure back in the case. When the engine is new, it's probably going to have more oil pressure than when it gets older, and this compensates for that wear factor as well. Now, the other thing this valve does is controls when is the correct time to allow that oil to circulate through the oil cooler on top of the block. On these single relief cases, they did not have what we call the doghouse cooler. The oil cooler was in the fan housing. It was flat, and it would allow the air, after it went through the oil cooler, to continue over cylinders 3 and 4. In very hot weather conditions, this could cause a lot of stress on cylinders 3 and 4, and they would pull on the head studs. These older engines used 10mm head studs that went straight into the engine block. Under normal operating conditions, there wasn't a problem. But as things got old, and in weather conditions where it was overheated, or somebody was driving it incorrectly or too hard, it would get hot, and over time it weakened the threads enough where the head would actually lift. There is no head gasket between the head and the cylinder, or on the newer engines, there's no gasket between the bottom of the cylinder and the engine block. We usually put high temp silicone around that area to seal it. On these older engines, they used to use a little paper gasket, and they didn't leak, and most of these older engines are an oily, grimy mess. Eventually they all become oily, grimy messes if you don't make some effort to clean them up. Okay, now on this block here, we'll look at this one. This is the dual relief case, and I'm going to show you. It has the same oil relief in the same spot. And as far as I know, it takes the same spring piston, and it had the retaining cap to hold it in place. In addition to that, they added another relief valve on the flywheel side of the engine. That one used a shorter spring, but the same piston, I'm pretty sure. And then the same type of a plug would go on the bottom of that. So it kind of went together like this, with the flat part being on the top, not the hollow part. This slides up and down. You want to make sure that that works freely. Looking at this right off from the bottom, one of the first things you'll notice is how big the pickup tube is on the newer engine as compared to the pickup tube on the older engine, the single relief. That's because the single relief case had a smaller oil pump. The gears weren't as long. They were 22mm, and the newer ones had a 26mm. They could move more oil, more volume of oil at a higher pressure, and that's why they needed the second oil relief valve, because of that higher pressure. This second valve was added as the life of the engine went on, as it got older and more use and more clearance in there. this valve would close so that you maintained the correct oil pressure from this engine life as a baby as to an older man. Wish I had one of those valves in my system because my pressure's changing. So, okay, so there's some differences. You had a bigger pump, a bigger pickup, a second relief valve at the end of the oil galley. So besides dumping it right there, going from the pump, picking it up, going from the pump and back into the case like this one does, it would do it there, but it also would travel the length of the case before it dumped. There's a main oil galley there that feeds the crankshaft journals, which feeds the connecting rod journals and the camshaft journals. And remember, the camshaft is under the crankshaft, and so all that spill off is flooding on top of the camshaft. Okay? So you're getting a whole bunch of information here. The oil cooler was bigger. It was offset in a different place so that the air did not get preheated and go over cylinders 3 and 4. It went out of the engine compartment. About the same time they were doing this, they came out with the dual port head. They also changed the size of the oil passages in here. They also changed the size of the head stud. Instead of just using the raw metal of the case, they put in a larger steel insert, and that allowed it to grip better. This is a larger head bolt, the 10 millimeter, so they were still able to use a large contact area to grip it in the case. But the 8 millimeter stud, this is 10, and the newer ones used 8 millimeter, and it would expand and shrink according to the temperature of the engine to keep a uniform pressure on the head and cylinder so it didn't leak, and it would last longer. This design came out on a 1600 engine. As far as I know, they never made a dual relief case. Well, I do not know. I take that back. When I don't know something is fact, I'll take it back. I shouldn't have said that. They may have made, because I know they made single port 1600 engines, because I had them in different cars. I was not a Volkswagen person always. I wouldn't have anything to do with a Volkswagen. I traded off my '67 Mustang when I got married at the age of 19, and we had a baby that first year we got married, and I traded off my Mustang for a '71 Toyota Corolla, and I drove that car for 17 years. I brought my daughter home from the hospital in that, and she learned to drive in that car, and then she wrecked it. So I got interested in Volkswagens after I got divorced. After my daughter was grown, I got a ride in a sandrail, and it was VW powered, had a 2180 in it, and I was hooked. This was the way to go. I had a quad, 1982 Suzuki 185 four-wheeler, and I'd put my son and daughter on the back, and we'd ride around. Occasionally I'd do something stupid, and it was always a problem having those kids hanging on behind me. And I thought, wow, this sandrail's cool. I can have them next to me. I could put anybody and strap them in next to me. We can have a easier conversation, and it was more fun, and performance became key. And as I started collecting Volkswagen parts for my sandrails, I acquired cars, and I interchanged parts, and finally got one that ran, started driving it to work, and gained a real respect for the endurance, durability, and economy of that type of a car. And I've just been cheap and never left, and acquired more Volkswagens, and I'm always been interested in wrenching on these things, and I wanted more performance and more power, just like you do. That's why you come back to my channel, to learn what I already learned. I paid thousands and thousands of dollars to get where I am today. Excuse me, I'll be right back. Okay, lost my train of thought there with that phone call. Sorry about that. At any rate, I think we pretty much covered things. One other thing that I wanted to talk about is you'll occasionally see these aftermarket kits for these oil relief systems, and it usually includes a taller piston like that, has that groove in it, and what they claim is that it will give you more oil pressure. The way it gives you more oil pressure is that it doesn't dump the oil back in the crankcase. Now, why would you need more oil pressure? The old school hot rodders used to say 10 pounds of oil pressure for every 1,000 RPM. So if you were turning maximum stock RPM, that would be 40 psi. And you know, there's not many Volkswagen's engines out there that turn that RPM or more than that. If you put in a performance cam and stiffer springs on your valves, you can extend that RPM range. You can extend that RPM range in first gear and possibly second. If you got a heavy car like a bus, you could get in a situation where you could be coasting downhill and the weight of the vehicle will over rev the engine. So in high RPM conditions, in racing type of conditions, you would want that extra oil pressure, and I think that's what they had in mind. You see these, you know, in off-road magazines. This would be the one that goes by the oil pump, and then the solid one would be the one that goes by the flywheel side. I don't recommend using these on a dual relief case. I do not use them on my cars. I learned over the years that the stock stuff works best. I don't have as many oil leaks or problems. I have seen people blow the seals on their oil cooler out on the sand dunes on a cool morning when they started up and they use these things. This will work for any RPM range up to 6,000 RPM if you're using a good quality oil and you have a good engine within tolerances and are using the correct oil pump. And that's really all I have to say about that. I've had these in my cars and I've taken them out. On this particular engine, I had one of these screws that had an Allen bolt in it, and then it had a little cup washer that you could change the pressure of the spring. You could increase the pressure. What that was doing was delaying the dump point. And I don't know. It leaked, and I don't think it was necessary. I ran it because I saw an article on it, and I got to do this and that. And we all get sucked into that. I spent thousands of dollars on stuff that was unnecessary. Either we're looking for stuff that's shinier, more bling in our engine compartment. All of this stuff is unnecessary. As I've told you before in my last video, I have every size engine practically. You know, I never built an 1835 or a 2180. Those are good motors. If you have them, great. I never built a 1915 either. You didn't used to be able to get the thicker wall cylinders. Now you can get the standard wall thickness cylinders on the 94 jugs and the 92s. Things have changed over the years, and they know how to make stuff and make it live. We should probably touch base too on the cases themselves. They offer now the AS41 case and aluminum case. Back in the day, they made the AS41 case, and the factory replacement case for that was an AS21, and it had a little bit more silicone in it, made it a little bit harder, but it was still a magnesium aluminum alloy case material. Now they have pretty much figured out these aluminum cases. I bought one and built my 2-liter motor with it. It has the best oil pressure of any of my engines all of the time. It is quieter and needs less attention than my other engines. Now, why, if aluminum was so great, why didn't Volkswagen use that on all of them? Well, they switched to all aluminum cases when they came out with the Type 4 motor. There's an example, which makes me believe it was a good idea. And I personally have never heard anybody rebuild a Type 4 motor that had to line bore that engine case. That's just me and the people I've talked to that mess with them. Now, what else about the aluminum engine cases? They're heavier, and when you have to machine them, you have to lubricate the tooling that machine those cases. So that costs the factory more to do. And this stuff is cheaper and more readily available, and it's lighter. If you can save 20 pounds on the build of a car, that's going to make it handle different. If you've ever had a light car or even a standard Volkswagen and put 1 or 2 people in it, you know the difference it makes on climbing a hill. So anyhow, I got someplace I gotta go with my best friend Mary, and I'll talk to you later. Thanks for watching. Thanks for subbing. TheEZGZ out.